Deliverance by James Dickey, the book upon which the classic film is based. So, I may have said it before that one thing that I like to do sometimes is to read books that have been overshadowed by their film adaptations, and Deliverance definitely qualifies. A lot of people are probably familiar with the movie Deliverance, but not a lot of people may be aware that it's actually based on a novel. And I wanted to read that novel and kind of see how it measures up against the film and kind of analyze what the book is all about, because Deliverance is what you might denote as a literary thriller. It is an adventure story. However, underneath the surface narrative, there are certain questions at the story's heart, questions about the divide between civilization and savagery and which side is actually superior, as well as questions about masculinity and nature. This book definitely does have things on its mind. And so join me, won't you, as I go down the river, so to speak, and kind of explore what James Dickey's novel Deliverance is actually all about. To summarize the story of Deliverance, if you haven't seen the movie and are not aware of what it is about, shame on you if you haven't, because that movie is an absolute stone cold classic, and definitely give it a watch if you haven't, because it is well worth a viewing. But anyway, if you aren't familiar with the story of Deliverance, the Deliverance tells the story of a canoe trip taken by four men down a rather dangerous river. These men are Ed, the narrator of the novel, Lewis, Bobby, and Drew. These men are city slickers who have come to the river to kind of get away from suburbia for a time and reconnect with nature, as well as test themselves against it. However, they unfortunately cross paths with some rather sadistic hillbillies with a penchant for sodomy and end up having to fight for their lives just to get home. Each of these four men is something of an archetype in that they all embody a different aspect of modern living. Lewis, who is the driving force behind the novel's plot, the reason why they go on the canoe trip to begin with, is kind of a survivalist, doomsday prepper type guy who sees that modern society kind of breeds soft people who aren't really well equipped to deal with hardship or adversity in a physical sense, at least. And so he constantly pushes himself to be more and more adept. Now, opposite to him at the other end of the spectrum, we have the character of Bobby, who kind of embodies all the worst aspects of modern civilization. He is soft, complacent, lazy, unambitious. He's kind of just been debased by modern civilization, and he takes advantage of city life because it provides for an easy life. But then we have the character of Drew, and Drew is, I think, the most noble and admirable character in the book. And the book's narrator, Ed, also espouses this same view later on in the book, because Drew also really likes life in the city, but unlike Bobby, who has been kind of debased by it, Drew really believes in the virtues of civilization, in law and order and justice. He really adheres to these ideals, even in the most trying of circumstances. He doesn't buckle, he doesn't waver from his adherence to these ideals, even at the book's most trying time. And then we have the book's narrator, Ed, who is kind of the middleman. He at times leans towards Bobby's point of view, in that he also likes his life in the city because it's not particularly hard and he has all the amenities he really wants or needs. But he also sees Lewis's point of view and understands that there is kind of an underlying ennui at the heart of suburbia, and so he has come on this trip to kind of try to escape that. And he looks up to Lewis and his robust outdoorsmanship, and kind of tries to emulate that, and has to emulate that as the story goes on. So these are the characters of Deliverance and what I believe they are meant to embody. Now, stories are most often driven by conflict, and when we talk in terms of storytelling, there are different types of conflict which can propel a narrative. usually denoted by the phrase man versus. You have man versus man, good guy versus bad guy. You have man versus self, which is about a person overcoming their own weaknesses and shortcomings to achieve a greater degree of, well, greatness. And then we have man versus nature, which are often survival stories about men having to overcome the environment, the natural elements, in order to live. And Deliverance has all three of these conflicts. It has man versus nature, definitely, because it starts out on a river, and the river nearly kills them because it is a really dangerous and powerful river. It also has man versus man, because when they get waylaid by the sodomous hillbillies, they have to fight for their very lives against other humans. And it also has man versus self, because Ed, the novel's narrator and therefore the central character, has to come to terms with himself as a person and overcome his own weaknesses and his own, foibles in order to save the day, in order to get them out of this predicament that they have been in. And so Deliverance is really a well-rounded book in terms of the conflicts which drive it, because it kind of has a little bit of everything almost. So, if you have seen the film Deliverance, chances are that the most memorable scene in that movie will likely be the pig squealing scene, the sodomy scene. And that's definitely in the book, although all the dialogue about squealing like a pig and you sure got a purty mouth, that's actually unique to the film. But this is the kind of the defining scene in the story. And it's actually set up really well due to contrast with an earlier scene in the book. So before going on the canoe trip, Ed has sex with his wife in the same position, I'll say, as the hillbilly later rapes Bobby in. And it makes for, like I said, a nice contrast, because it links these two scenes in our minds and forces us to see their difference and also their similarities. So, in the beginning of the book, they start out in the city, and then as the story goes on, they move to the wilderness and the hill country where the hillbillies live. And this denotes a shift in worlds, which is reflected in the change given in regards to how sex and sexuality are portrayed. In the beginning of the book, when Ed has sex with his wife, it's very, loving. It's an act of affection. But when the hillbilly rapes Bobby, it's decidedly not. It is not an act of love at all, but an act of domination. And this really rams home one of the book's central themes: the relationship between civilization and savagery, in the move to an older order of things, where sex isn't really about love, it's an act of domination. You can see the same thing in like prison. This story could have really been set as just as well in prison and gotten that theme across, because we all know, prison sex is often about domination and submission. And that happens here in this book. The hillbillies belong to an older, more brutal world, and a much less refined world, in which sex, again, is not really an act of affection or love, but one of domination and brutality. And again, it's a really nice kind of setup between the sex scene earlier in the book and the rape scene later, because it forces us to recognize just how far beyond the pale we are. Much like in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the river upon which the story of Deliverance takes place is not just a physical setting, but also a metaphor. The river in Deliverance is a really dangerous river. In fact, it is so dangerous that at the beginning of the story, the river has not even entirely been mapped, because it is so dangerous that nobody has ever really been able to navigate it all the way. And that's what draws the men to the river, because it is one of the last few places in the continental United States that hasn't been explored. And once they get on the river initially, they don't really like it, because it's hard. It's not easy. It does not provide or lend itself to any of the comforts which these men have known. And it is really dangerous, and it will, and very nearly does, kill them. However, as the story goes on, and Ed has to, pony up to go kill the hillbilly who is stalking them, the river serves as a metaphor of primal significance, primal strength. The river is something much older than the suburbia from which these men hail, and it's also something much stronger as well. And Ed, in turn, comes to draw a certain strength from the river into himself because he admires its power and he comes to respect it. And he says at the end of the book, because the book takes place, they take the canoe trip because the river is about to be dammed. If you haven't seen the movie, the river is about to be dammed and it's going to disappear. It's going to become a lake. And that happens at the end of the book. And Ed remarks that the river exists now only in him, that he is the home of the river because the river is gone, so it only exists in his mind. But also, the river exists in him as well because he knows that he was able to resort to the kind of strength and violence that was necessary to extricate themselves from the situation they had gotten into. And so, not only does the river exist as a memory, but its strength, its legacy, its power exists, at least in a small measure, with him as well. As Cormac McCarthy said, the novel depends for its life upon the books which have come before it, and Deliverance is no exception. Reading the book, I was able to identify two precedents, you might say, books which may have inspired Deliverance or at least have certain themes that they do share. The first would be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in that both books are stories of men traversing rivers and losing their humanity along the way, but also William Golding's Lord of the Flies. In fact, I believe that Deliverance is something of an inversion of Lord of the Flies. If you've read that book, you will know that the central metaphor in that book is the beast, and that the characters in the book come to learn that the beast is not something that exists outside of people, but rather inside. And Ralph, the central character of that book, ultimately rejects that and rejects the savagery embodied by the character of Jack. And Lord of the Flies is very condemnatory of that base human violence. But Deliverance is not. In fact, Deliverance kind of asks the question, is it always good to deny the beast, or is it sometimes better to give in? Do there exist certain scenarios in which civility is actually a hindrance? Because as the story goes on, and as they're being stalked by this murderous hillbilly, and Ed has to, if you've seen the movie, he has to climb the cliff and kill the hillbilly guy with a bow and arrow, which is a very primitive weapon. And this stands in stark contrast to all the ideals and attitudes which he espoused, at the book's beginning. Because as an inhabitant of the city, he ostensibly believes in, nonviolence, passivity, justice, law and order, all that good stuff. But the only way that they're getting out of this scenario, out of this predicament, the book makes very clear, is if he can kill this other man. That it comes down to very primal violence. He's either going to have to kill this hillbilly guy or he will be killed. They'll all be killed. And he kills him. He does. He buckles down, he climbs that cliff, and he kills that guy. And they only get out of the predicament of their quagmire by reverting to savagery, by becoming just as savage as the hillbilly guy on the cliff who's shooting at them. And the book doesn't condemn that at all. And so, again, kind of a hard question that this book asks is, can civility sometimes be a detriment? Can it be a hurdle? Sometimes do you have to let go and, reach down into that base beast inside and let it out in order to, just survive? And again, it's not an easy question, but it is probably a very important one, I would say. But now we come to the heart of the matter, as well as the meaning of the book's title, Deliverance, and the question of whether there actually is any deliverance to be found anywhere. In the book's beginning, Ed wants deliverance from the stagnation of his suburban life, and he thinks that he will find that in nature. However, once they get to nature and encounter that older, more primal type of world, they learn that it isn't very redeeming either. And at the end of the book, even Lewis, who was the one who wanted them to go on the trip so badly, is kind of humbled and isn't quite as avid in his outdoorsman pursuits after their ordeal. And so the question really does hang over the book. Is there any deliverance at all? Is there any deliverance in nature or civilization, either one? Or do people kind of have to deliver themselves, as Ed has to do, because he is kind of the closest thing to deliverance that they have in the book, because he is the one who gets them out. He's the one that has to pony up, climb the cliff, kill the evil hillbilly guy, and enable them to escape. And it really is just kind of an open-ended book in that regard, in that you don't really know the central question of where any real deliverance is to be found in nature or in civilization, either one, or maybe it has to come from within. Who knows? Now, as to my personal reaction to Deliverance, I thought it was a pretty good book, although not a great book, and that has to do almost entirely with the writing. So, if you don't know, James Dickey was primarily a poet. In fact, he actually won the National Book Award for poetry. He only actually wrote, I think, three novels. But knowing that James Dickey was a poet, I was kind of surprised at how unpoetic this book actually was. In fact, this book is not very well written, I don't think. He uses lots of hyphenated words where other words would have served better. He often describes things redundantly, using the same words twice when they could have just been used once. And there isn't really much flair to the writing. It's pretty kind of simplistic, really. And overall, I just was not really impressed at all by the writing in Deliverance. I don't think it was a very well written book on a prose level. The characters, well, as I've said before, when you write a book in first person, you kind of get an out, because the only character that you really have to round out and make fully realized is the narrator. And I think James Dickey did succeed with this in Deliverance, because Ed is a pretty rounded character. He has an arc, definitely. He definitely has an arc from kind of meek, unconfident city slicker to hardened hillbilly slaying woodsman badass. And it's maybe not the most nuanced or subtle, but he gets the job done, and it does give us a journey, a psychological journey to go on, as well as the physical in this book. So the characters, where it counted, it got the job done. The plot is pretty well paced. I think there was a couple points, especially in that extended cliff climbing scene, where he kind of just lingered on describing the river and the landscape, and again, not in the most poetic fashion. But overall, it's a pretty breezy read. It's not even 300 pages, so I think it moves pretty well. So overall, I think it's a pretty well done book. I think the movie is better, though. The movie is an all-time classic, and again, if you haven't seen it, definitely give it a watch. But the book is just a pretty good book, I'll say. And you know, Deliverance crops up on lists of the best books of the 20th century, and I don't really know how, honestly. Again, it's a good book, but it's not really a great book, I don't say. The writing really brings it down in my regard. And so to rate Deliverance, I think I will give it just a good solid B. Oh yeah, Deliverance by James Dickey. Have you read Deliverance, or have you seen the movie? If you have either one, let me know down in the comments what you thought about the book slash movie, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. If you haven't read Deliverance, you might want to pick it up. It is a pretty thrilling and exciting book at times, and again, it does have some things to say. It has some questions to ask. I think this really could be categorized as a literary thriller. But if you haven't seen the movie, once again, definitely give that a watch, because that's just again, that's a stone cold classic. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. And until next time, peace.